Welcome, everyone. We're witnessing a new machine age. This is the second revolution after the first industrial revolution that gave us 1 millionx potential when we compared the human physical exertion of power to now us launching tons of mass to space without even thinking about it. If we reflect on that and we think about the intelligence age and we think what potential that lies ahead, there's a significant opportunity that's coming up. Economically speaking, we're thinking in the next 5 years, anywhere between $10 to $20 trillion is the economic impact. However, there's a catch to this. Similar to how in the digital economy we've seen concentration of power, we're seeing the similar dynamic within the intelligence age. There's a concentration of power, a concentration of value within a handful of actors, whether they're public or private, that capture the main ingredients of success. These are specifically about talent, ideas, and capital. If we think about the top IP in AI, in 5G, in blockchain, and others, there's 80% of them that's concentrated in 5 countries. Similarly, out of the world's 1,500 unicorns, they're concentrated in 4 to 5 countries, and we are seeing this dynamic further and further. The question becomes, how do we create an economy in the future that's more equitable and accessible broadly, both for individuals, corporates, and other governments, so that no one is left behind? In today's session, we're going to focus specifically about democratizing access to AI, and we're thinking about this is not only about technology, but rather access to opportunity, to agency, and also to future relevance. I'm delighted to have with me today Nigel Toon, who's the CEO and co-founder of Graphcore, Shrini Viswanath, who's the co-founder of Upstox, and Abhinav Shashank, the CEO of Innovaccer, and Parminder, Bhatia, Chief AI Officer of GE Healthcare. I'm going to start with you, Nigel, and specifically speak about the access to infrastructure. Today, nearly half of the world lacks digital infrastructure. How do you think about ensuring equitable access for the rest of the world, especially for startups, researchers that are outside of major markets?
Yeah, I think it's a really big issue. So if you look at all of these economic waves that have come before, the build out of electricity or the build out of the internet, you always see the investment in infrastructure that kind of precedes that. And that tends to happen in the established markets. And then as the technology becomes more broadly based, you see sort of follow-on investments into other areas. It's also about reducing the cost, because today the cost of this equipment is just incredible, and this is a journey that Graphcore has been on. We recently sold the business to SoftBank to give us access to the capital that's needed really to develop these next generation products and make them more available also at all the different levels as well. But I think it's also the stack that sits above just the hardware, which also needs to be very open and very available. The availability of open source large language models, for example. We're just seeing the build out of this software stack that people will build applications on top of, and ensuring that that is broadly available, that it's open source and allows people to really innovate, I think is very important. And I think the final point I would make is also the danger with AI is AI, if you think about, data is just the source. Information is then when you add context to data, and it's from the information that you build the intelligence. And the risk is if the context is not appropriate for your culture, to take UAE as an example, if you don't have the cultural understanding, then the information that you're working from won't necessarily be suited to your environment, won't necessarily be suited in your country. So, I really applaud the efforts that the UAE, for example, has made in this area with things like the Falcon AI project to make open source large language models available in Arabic language, and attacking this whole issue of how do you include these cultural elements into the AI as well.
Fantastic, and that's a great leeway into the second part, because as you think about infrastructure, which is the basis for everything to build upon, I want to touch upon the applications that are built on top. And Shrini, to your point, when you think about democratizing access to financial services, fintech is one of the immediate things that come to mind, right? And you're building a fintech company that's scaling across users. How do you ensure that both within the company, but also to the users that you're doing, you're creating that accessible and equitable access to AI?
So on that point, making AI accessible and relaying what Nigel said, right? To sort of get access to these models that are widely available in all over the world, but generally concentrated to just 4 or 5 countries as a source of them, how do you sort of scale it to other countries that are not sort of at the epicenter of AI? Right, so at Upstox, one is we're a regulated entity, so that means that compliance, information security, these are non-negotiables for us. And when it comes to AI and our geography, our customers are in India, which is a very linguistically diverse country. So it has been sort of a challenge bringing AI and trying to make it fit into sort of a non-homogeneous country like India. And some of the challenges that we faced, one, are cost, right? So what we found out is that the cost of actually hosting the AI models is much cheaper in a place like, say, the Eastern United States versus anywhere else in the world. But because we're a regulated financial services company, we cannot host any sort of AI model or send customer data outside of our national region. So one thing that we've had to sort of evaluate is how do we sort of bring the same high level quality of information to our customers, but actually keep the cost low. Second point being, not all AI models are open source, some are closed source, and beyond that, we also foresee going into a world where probably even if they are available, they may be restricted by treaties between countries or because of the current geopolitical situation. Not all countries may have equal access to all AI models, right? And we're living in an age where every week, every month, there's a new AI model that massively surpasses the previous AI models that are out there. And it's in every company's interest to be aligned and up to date with the latest and greatest. The third point that we've seen as sort of a hindrance to getting AI for everyone is that most of the corpus, the data that the AI is trained on, is usually in the English language. So if you're trying to talk to a customer in India or in Western Europe whose native language is German or Tamil, it doesn't perform as well as it would if you were to ask that question in English, right? And so some of the challenges that we find is how do you take an AI that's trained in a data-rich language like English and then give it to a customer whose primary language is not English and yet give them that same high-quality answer that they should get.
Very good. And Abhinav, I want to move to you, and you focus a lot on healthcare systems, right? And we were having a chat before around how we need to move from POC to scaling these systems and making them more usable, right? Can you tell us more about your experience in moving AI beyond the build and POC stage? How do you scale it and make it actually usable by the actual people who are going to benefit from it?
Yeah. So I think like especially in areas like healthcare where it is a matter of like I think life and death, right? Like you don't really want to have like experimental models in production in general, right? Like so I think a lot of what there has been like a lot of push, at least in the US right now, on figuring out like I think what is the framework for governance and what is the framework for testing these models out, like especially if they have clinical applications. But a lot of like I think even the low-hanging fruit right now for most healthcare enterprises is to effectively think about the administrative workload that we've basically put on our providers in general. And anyone who's basically like I think experienced healthcare like in the US really knows it's just hard like to access healthcare. And a lot of that is because of the administrative complexity that was being brought by the last generation of information architecture per se. Now, if you could basically really think about letting a little bit of that information architecture loose, and you can then basically redefine what each of these workflows could sort of really look like. You can rethink basically how people get paid. You can really rethink about like how do you schedule things. You can think about like a lot of things around care navigation. You can think about like different ways of like triaging patients. Every part of like the healthcare ecosystem is up for change over the next 10 years or so, and maybe like even shorter, but like I think definitely 10. But if you start thinking about a lot of these things, there are fundamental needs that need to be thought through right now. Like in the last generation of technology that like I think came in healthcare, we basically like hurried into it. The government basically like I think defined that this is like I think the 10 ways that an electronic health record should basically be built, and everyone basically built like the electronic health record based on like I think those things. Like the result, healthcare was the only space in which basically technology brought inefficiency rather than efficiency. Like for every time basically we implemented technology, the cost of care basically went up because the processes became more complicated. Everything basically became more complicated. We shouldn't basically like I think like do the same mistake at this point. And what we've sort of really learned, I think, like through the initial implementations of like our AI agents and models that we've sort of really built up, is that thinking about like what is the transformation going to look like, building out like an infrastructural capability on how will these models basically exchange data, that like my scheduling agent, if that is not basically passing on information to my clinical decision support agent, and my clinical decision support agent is not passing out data to my billing agent, we are going to be like in such deep mess. And all of this hype around AI that we are sort of really thinking about, it will become an operational nightmare for everyone to basically go solve for. So thinking through like what change management is, like how does basically all of this governance infrastructure basically look like, how will these models basically exchange information, what will be the communication framework around this, is basically areas that people need to be thinking about. And like I think the cute little basically like projects have, that time is done, right? Like everyone basically did the cute little POC, and like I think it worked great for a little bit, and then people realized that like this is not really going to work out. So I think this is the time where like we need to start thinking about like what is the new information infrastructure, how do we sort of really think about building governance frameworks, and what is my change management plan going to look like. And as you sort of really said, at least right now, 70 to 80% of like I think the leadership time like at all enterprises should be going towards thinking about like change management rather than thinking about technology, because like the technology is basically moving. Like we will get to basically like large language models, small models, like all of these things, MCP architectures, how does this basically like I think like fit into the broader ecosystem, all of that is basically going to get solved. The thing that we have to basically think about as enterprise leaders is what is going to be change management, because the way work is going to evolve for everyone, and especially in healthcare, is going to be massive, like for sure. So that's going to be like I think a little bit of my view on that.
Thank you. I think that's a fantastic point that you bring about. In BCG, also in our AI transformations, we also have the motto of like 10, 20, 70, right? Where we say 10% is on the algorithms and technology, 20% is on the data, and 70% is on people, process, and change management. And what we actually see in reality is that a lot of the executives are flipping that equation, right? Are putting the 70, 80% of the focus on the technology and ignoring how that interaction happens within their organizations. And if you think about the immediate future, right, there's people who need to be moderating those AI systems, governing them, thinking about that, but also in the a bit further future about having autonomous agents working hand in hand with other people. That symbiotic relationship, or that bionic relationship between human and machine, is not yet cracked in a sense. And I think this is one area that we should put even more emphasis on going forward, especially in critical systems like healthcare. And Parminder, maybe if you can, you're also looking into that from a healthcare perspective, how the systems are overwhelmed, how can we get more efficiency from that? Can you comment more on what Abhinav said as well?
Yeah, sounds good. So as we look across from AI perspective at G Healthcare, we have been looking from machine learning, deep learning, and now into the AI field where we have the highest number of AI-enabled medical devices across the world. So a lot of AI has been built out over the years. And when we look into the efficiency side of things, I think like even the devices, how do we make our devices smarter? So for instance, your MR in the past, it used to take 3 scans in an hour. Now with AI, it's a premier technology we launched around the COVID time in 4 years back. Condiel, it reduces the scan time by 50% with same image quality. So now imagine from the efficiency perspective, a hospital is able to get twice the number of scans with the same resources. And it's also good for the patients because in the past, a lot of patients could not sit for that longer time. We're increasing the access of scale with these technologies where it's better for the patients, better for the providers, as well as improving on the administrative and the operational efficiency side of things as well. The other end of the spectrum is you talked about autonomous system. How do we start from the semi-autonomous systems? I think that's where it comes around. So in handheld ultrasound, we have a technology called as Caption AI. Think of it as a navigation system or a co-pilot kind of an experience where it tells you, hey, move a little left, move a little right, and now you have a diagnostic quality image. So its implication is huge if we think about it, because now even a technician with less skills to be able to use an ultrasound can use these devices. You can have more of remote access as well. You can get the scan done in a remote setting, use digital and cloud to bring out those access to the hospital in more high density areas as well. So that's the high level areas where you're starting to see impact of these technologies from automation, streamlining these things. And then on post pandemic, we have seen more focus on operational efficiency side of things as well, where how do we really streamline the operations across the hospital? How many beds are going to be available in next 3 hours, 6 hours? Can I actually bring in a new patient across the spectrum? Can we actually streamline these across different operations where a lot of these things are still with sticky notes or coordination and meeting that have to be carried out? Can digital and AI really transform these? Can predictive AI really streamline these things as well? And that's where we have seen some gains as well. So one of our technologies, Command Center, it's deployed in 300 plus hospitals across the world. And it has shown value where customers have been able to see a lot of efficiencies without actually having to add physical beds, where they're able to streamline these operations as well.
Very good. And maybe just a follow-up to what you just said. You're looking primarily from a downstream perspective, right? So this is where you have the actual system and you're seeing how can people get access to that. If you think also upstream, can you speak more about how are you at GE ensuring that you have representative models and representative data by design to ensure access to the people later on so that it's equitable, it's also representative of the actual population that you're serving?
Building an AI algorithm was 20%. I would say now it has become 10% of the time. A lot of time actually goes into multi-site validation. So when we talk about a lot of these AI-enabled medical devices, it has to go through. So a lot of time is actually spent on making sure it can work across hundreds and hundreds of hospitals, getting that feedback before it is actually prime time ready for different components as well. So building an algorithm usually is 3 to 6 months, and then it takes years to get these technologies. So even the technology that I talked about, Condiel, it took a lot of time to get that validation. And that kind of showed into the scale as well. The technology has gone through 35 million plus scans across the world. So you're talking about the implication of how you build it responsibly, making sure there is enough coverage across these different areas as well. Now with foundation models, it is changing the paradigm of representation as well, because now you're training a model with large amounts of unannotated data, which is learning across multiple settings, and then you're easily customizing across multiple settings as well. So one of the foundation models we actually announced on ultrasound is used for segmentation, and it really provides an experience of taking a smartphone kind of a photo for a physician where they can identify a region of interest. They're looking into a tumor or a bone part. They can click on that and they can get to that part. They can see how it moves in the body as well. Now, what was quite interesting from this technology is it performs quite well. But how is it different than anything in the past? The model was never trained on breast lesion. It was never trained on fetal head. It still had 90% plus dice score. So you're talking about building a technology which is already starting at 90 versus 50 or 60. So now how do you start creating those applications again to the point of taking POCs to actual production use cases? You're starting at 90 and now you can easily customize and create that feedback loop as well. The other area which is coming out is how do we create feedback loop You have iPhone, it gets updated every 3-4 months. In healthcare, those updates still take time. And I think that's where regulatory system can also be really helping in those systems, how you get those faster updates so that you can update those technologies when you're getting that feedback at a faster pace than in the past.
Fantastic. And I think you bring also a good point about the representation of data in the specific models. And Nigel, maybe to your point as well, today when we look into the models that are out there, roughly speaking, there is 80% of them which are trained on a very subscale of the data. I'd say 20 to 30% of the data available out there. How do you think about training those models in a way that creates more inclusivity, that creates more representation, but also whether they're both on the cultural or also the technical side, representative of the populations?
Yeah, I think this is it's a really interesting area, and we've sort of touched on some of these points already. I think the thing I always keep in my mind is that the AI we have today is the worst AI we're ever going to have. It's going to get a lot better from here, and part of that is really about building that much richer context. You think about language models, for example. Language is one modality that we use to capture and share information. It's just an encoding scheme we use to share information between each other. And if you think about vision, for example, there's much richer information in vision. We think about the models that we as humans build about the world around us. This is going to be a really important area. And thinking about how that translates across different cultures as well, and the different traditions that people have, the different values that people have in different cultures. I think this is a huge area. The piece which I think has come out already is the AI is going to get better. It has to be trained really on the information. The information becomes the critical piece here in terms of how do you collect that in your different environment? How do you use that? AI that can feed off, say, through retrieval augmentation, your specific information and bring that in to be used in your applications is very important. But then also the way in which we actually implement these systems, which I think has also come out from the conversations. We need to be really careful we're not just automating what we currently do. We need to think much more carefully about how do we change the process? How do we change the way that AI can augment and really improve the way in which we operate? And I think, this is going to be a learning, and the countries and the companies that can kind of capture that and can move ahead at pace in those areas are really the ones that I think are going to win in a really big way here. And I think, it's one of the big opportunities here in the Middle East as well.
I like this point very well, especially on the point of not reinforcing the existing workflows and the design that you already have, right? Like Elon Musk in a recent interview said, if you're digging yourself in a hole, make sure you don't get more efficient in the digging process, right?
Exactly. And it's you think about Google Maps, for example, probably one of the best AI applications there is out there. It helps you get to where you want to go using conventional techniques. But what that mapping technique allows is it allows car services to be able to find you, to be able, to connect you with cars, to get you to where you want to go. That's a recreation of the system. It's a rethinking of the traditional system. And, that's just a really simple example. So if you think about in healthcare, the way in which, you might build an AI system that is able to model particular molecules, connect them to a protein connects to a cell, to be able to deliver that molecule to make really efficient medicines that just connect in the right way to create no side effects as well. This is the way. And I think the whole debate goes on a lot about artificial general intelligence, as though AI is going to be this one thing that's all encompassing. I think that's completely the wrong way to think about it. We've got to think about AI being artificial expert intelligence, where it's really expert in particular areas, because then you can test it. Then you can know that it's giving you a good answer. You can build in something called uncertainty quantification. When you talk to an expert, you expect them to say, well, I'm not quite sure about this. I think this is the answer, and this is why, and they'll give you reasons. Whereas when you talk to somebody, maybe in a bar, who's like the bar expert on something, they say with complete confidence, this is the answer to the question. They don't really know. They don't really understand. And so what we really need in AI is experts who can tell you, this we think is the answer, this is how certain we are or uncertain we are that this is a good answer, and we can actually test the system as well.
Fantastic. And Shrini, I want to come back to you. You mentioned earlier the markets you operate in have also a little bit of wider disparity when it comes to financial literacy, for example, right? As we look into the users. How do you ensure you're creating this balance between people who are more familiar and have the literacy to adopt and use those AI systems, say in fintech, but also between first-time users that there is a bit of a more learning journey to them prior to them being able to use and adopt and actually make full access of that?
So I think there's two paradoxes in finance that are as age-old as time, right? One of the things that I always these are things that I grapple with, is that one is that people who have money generally get access to the best loans, to the best offers to financing. People are always coming after you to say, why don't you take more money, take a loan, take everything, finance your new purchase and things like that. And on the opposite side, people who don't have good credit, essentially, they're the ones who actually need money, and they struggle to get a loan. They have to go through onerous paperwork. They face higher interest charges. There's more obstacles for them to get access to, right? And the second paradox that I think about is that when you have money, it's much easier to make money, right? So the people who have money generally have access to better tools. They have access to better networks. They have access to better advisories. They may have access to private assets that the general public don't have to, that they can then use to then grow their wealth, right? And essentially that compounds and creates more inequality over time. And I don't think that AI is today equipped to solve that equality problem and in one shot make everything equal. I don't think it's ever going to be solved. But in our experience, one of the first questions that we see when our customers come on board is they're interested in growing their wealth. They just don't know how to, and they're not willing to pay for an advisor because they find it cost prohibitive. This is where I think, and financial advice is very tricky, right? Because it's not a one formula fits all. You really have to understand what the end user wants to be able to get them on the journey, right? The first obstacle is, of course, convincing them that, as you mentioned, how do you ensure that they trust AI in the journey, they're comfortable working with AI in the journey? And the second is to actually make that transformative move of telling them, look, you have cash lying in your account doing nothing, that's just getting eaten away by inflation. I'm not telling you to go and put it into a high-flying stock or a high-flying IPO, right? Forget that, not even a mutual fund. But if you were to put that into a fixed deposit or a certificate of deposit, that's still doing some work for you versus doing no work at all, right? And that to me is a win. Getting people to, in many parts of the world, to just think of cash as something that's lying in your mattress, to then moving it to doing something that's working for you is still something that's really far away, right? And generally, again, we've not been able to break this barrier because of the high cost, because of the education aspect that's involved in it, because of teaching people how compound interest works. And I think that really with ubiquitous smartphones, amazing internet, and AI as a personalized assistant, where you cannot tell whether it's a human or an AI behind, nudging you to do the right decision, getting that person to get that money out of the mattress and putting it into something as simple as a fixed deposit, that to me is a big win.
I think that's a very good goal. However, there is something that's common also to the point, Abhinav, I want to bring to you between wealth and health, right? People are much more careful about these two aspects. Where do they put their money and how do they experiment with things that are related to their own health or the health of their families? And to some extent, that puts a little bit of a tension between the innovations in these aspects, where to some extent there is a little bit of a trial and error, there's a little bit of testing and learning, there's a little bit of failing throughout the process. How do you, Abhinav, think about balancing between this innovation in places like healthcare versus actually delivering the actual services that people want to be more sure about? What's the balance that you strike there?
So I think it's a tricky balance, frankly, right? Like, but what you have to basically understand is that as we are basically, most countries are effectively like, I think, like aging at this point, right? And the need of care is basically just going to become like much larger from where we are today, per se. If AI continues to progress, we are all probably going to live longer lives as well. So today, basically, like average expectancy, like life expectancy, depending on basically where you are, let's say like roughly 80 years, in all likelihood, because of advancement of like, I think like science and technology, we are probably going to live till 100. Like, I think I have a going bet with my wife that like if we get to live till 45, we are probably going to live till 150. Right, like because medical science is effectively like, I think, like moving very rapidly. So now imagine basically like the amount of people that are effectively going to enter an age where the need for healthcare for them is going to compound like massively, right? And this cycle basically like, I think, like is going to create like immense pressure on every country to really figure out ways to deliver care to these people in a continuous sort of like way. So if you just basically like, I think, just look at it like from a 10-year to 20-year sort of like view perspective, we are all going to need a lot more of healthcare. The US basically spends $4.5 trillion on healthcare today. Medical inflation has basically been like much faster than basically traditional inflation, like in almost every country on the planet. And if that basically continues to be like the way it's basically going, we are probably going to see like, I think, like today, like it's 20% of US GDP, it's probably going to get to 30, it's probably going to get to like 40 and 50, like very quickly. If that basically ends up happening, we are in trouble to a certain extent, right? Like, and therefore the need for technological advancement to increase access of care using basically tools and technologies and making our doctors far more efficient is much larger today than it has ever been in our entire history. And so from that perspective, like if you really start thinking about like what do I need to do, like how do, like everyone basically like, I think, like that I've initially, like, I think the skeptic of AI in healthcare basically would sort of really say that, hey, like, I think, like, will this replace doctors? Like, we have a massive shortage of doctors across the planet. Like, there is no way we are delivering basically care to the billions of people that are out there in anywhere close to basically what is acceptable. And therefore, we need more capacity. And like, our schools can only produce that many doctors. Like, there is basically just huge crunch of basically doctors that's that really exist across the planet. So if you have to increase capacity, you would need to basically, like, I think, like drive a lot more innovation on the delivery of care motions. How do you basically bring in technology in those motions? How do you, like, I think, democratize access to basically like world-class care that's basically being developed? Knowledge, like medical knowledge, is basically doubling every 8 weeks today. Like, and if that basically continues to sort of really happen, like, are we going to send all of our doctors to school every 8 weeks? Like, that's not going to happen. So all of these things, like, I think, are compounding at such fast pace that the only way to democratize access for world-class healthcare is the application of AI in very meaningful sort of like ways. And so, like, I think, like, our view is that, yes, like, I think there is all of the things that we need to be careful about, that we need to be thinking about in adoption of AI, but we should also basically know that this is inevitable and frankly, like, for the good of the society. That if all of us basically got the best care possible in general, that's good. Like, the shape and form of it, the way it's basically delivered, all of those things are basically nuances in general that, like, we should not be as worried about. But if we get like the degree of care that someone basically sitting, let's say, like in next at Stanford basically is able to get, like, I think, like across the world, we should all be aspiring towards that, like, for sure.
I think that's also a unique a little bit to healthcare, right? Where you need more of those jobs to serve the broader populations. The picture might be a bit different also in different industries, right? Where there's a bigger concern about replacing jobs and how do you manage at a company level, at a country level, transition of maybe few millions of jobs, especially when you speak about back office and so on, right? So, and in parallel to this, I think that's one aspect of the story. But in parallel to this, given the centralized nature of intelligence, especially the more you can concentrate intelligence, the more you can at least build stronger ones at the central level prior to deploying, there's a complexity in how many institutions, individuals, actors can participate in that central intelligence. And Nigel, I just want to pose that question to you. How do you ensure and how do you think about ensuring that people have the right participation, whether it's from humans, institutions, governments, while also not letting smaller, less competitive ones get left behind?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. It's interesting, isn't it? Just picking up on this healthcare discussion, I completely agree. But we've also got to change the process. We've got to do much more preventative health. We can't just rely on interventions. We need to do more screening, we need to do more healthy eating, we need to do more exercise, and AI can help, in terms of driving that process. So maybe that's kind of gives us a clue also to the question you just posed. If you think back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people basically built machines that replaced skilled workers, and there was displacement of those skilled workers by machines and less skilled operators. What happened in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution was we invented mass production, we invented consumer systems, and we changed the processes and actually created much more demand for product. We made products much more affordable. We created many more jobs. The jobs became more skilled in those situations. And I think the same can be true in AI. If what we do is we focus on just trying to use AI to automate existing jobs, then yes, we'll displace people and skilled people from those positions. But if instead what we do is we use AI to augment those jobs, if we think about how we change the process, again, use healthcare as an example. Today, when we build molecules for drugs, typically those molecules are handcrafted, and there's a limit to the complexity that the molecules can actually become. Using AI approaches and robotics, you can potentially build far more complex molecules that will be far more effective. You can automate the production of those, and rather than giving your IP to a wet lab in India or China, you can actually have a robotic system where your molecule can be encrypted and only the machine knows how to build it, and that can be in an environment where effectively your IP is completely protected. And so I think AI has this potential to completely change the way we actually operate in certain industries. We've used healthcare here as an example, we've used finance as an example, completely change the way we operate, but we need to change the system. AI isn't going to do it. Humans have to be part of that process to change the process, drive the change management.
Just to add to this one, at a high level, I think what has happened in the last 2 to 3 years, it's not just about large language models. I think when this technology came in, this was truly multimodal, so which is changing a completely different paradigm to the question that was brought in, where we were only looking at the image or the tech side of things. Now you can explore robotics. You can now start to explore how do you combine different things from image to voice to video to really open up a lot of new opportunities, which were not possible because we were looking into things in more from a silo perspective. So it does open up a lot of new opportunities, whether it's autonomous systems, whether it's robotics, whether it's streamlining things, which were not possible, I would say, 3 to 5 years back.
Fantastic. And I think there are a couple of themes that are emerging out of this, right? I think one theme that came out of the panel is the change management, the people, the process, right? Put much more emphasis on the soft side of things, not only on the technology and the data and the architecture. That is in the building, but the biggest value realizer or unlock is happening on the people, process, and change management. I think a second takeaway that was very interesting is the part that in the shorter term, AI is going to augment rather than to replace, especially in critical functions. So making sure that you're also having a systems of you're innovating to supplement human behavior and making sure that this is growing organically into later on maybe starting to have autonomous agents running those functions by themselves. And also, Nigel, I think you bring a third takeaway for me, which is think across the different waves of deploying, reimagining, reshaping the workflow. So it's not primarily about adding more technology to the same broken process. It's more rethink the process and in some places reinvent completely your business model or reinvent completely the way you're doing things so that AI can come in different ways and do that. I use sometimes a funny example to say if you're getting a cappuccino machine to replace a barista, you don't have to have the robotic handle that runs the same process. We do that in a one-press button. So I think this is a little bit similar to what you mentioned. But overall, I would like to thank you all for the very exciting discussions and looking forward to carrying on those discussions beyond the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.